18 years ago is an anniversary, as a matter of fact, December of 2000. One of the major water bills that the Congress passes, usually about every 5 to 7 years, was enacted. And they typically contain Army Corps of Engineers projects for water handling, for water channeling, the great rivers and lakes of America. All of these water projects that are so vital to the economic functioning of this country. Ports, dams, renourishment projects, beach renourishment, all across the country. This water bill was passed back in December of 2000, and it also authorized for the first time the comprehensive restoration plan for America's Florida Everglades. It was a 30-year, multi-billion-dollar effort to restore the Everglades. What had happened ever since the beginning of the previous century, in the early 1900s, as Florida started to be discovered, and as people increasingly had come, the way was paved in the late 1800s by Henry Flagler building his railroad. And the railroad went down the east coast of Florida. He would build it as far as he could get. First, St. Augustine built a big hotel. That hotel today is the administrative building of Flagler College in downtown St. Augustine. And then Flagler extended it on further to the Daytona Ormond Beach location, had another big hotel. Taking it further south all the way to West Palm Beach and building the famed Breakers Hotel in Palm Beach, as well as a Biltmore Hotel there as well. And then finally, Henry Flagler took it on to Miami and then did a feat thought impossible through a string of islands called the Florida Keys, took the railroad all the way to Key West. Well, of course, this was a means of travel that Americans in the Northeast were suddenly opening up to this beautiful land called La Florida in the Spanish, the name given by the Spanish conquistadors that came to Florida. And indeed, they came and they loved this land. As more and more people came and started settling, they found that sometimes Mother Nature was harsh. Because when Mother Nature came in its full display of fury, hurricanes would come, quick rainstorms would come, quick changes of temperature from warm to suddenly freezing cold, even with, albeit not a lot of snow, but I have seen parts of Florida with the ground covered in snow, and other parts that were pelted with freezing rain. As people tried to adapt to this land of contrasting environments, all of a sudden, they started to see the danger. And along in the late 1920s came a hurricane of such magnitude that when it hit the coast around West Palm Beach and then inland to Lake Okeechobee, 3,000 people were drowned. As a result of that experiment, as a result of that experience, what happened was the governmental structure said we've got to do something, and we've got to do it in flood control. And thus, the diking and draining for 3/4 of a century commenced under the rubric of flood control. Flood control that would get the water off the land when too much water came at one time. But what happened was they suddenly had a plan to reverse what Mother Nature had intended. Mother Nature intended for water as far north, southwest of today's Orlando, to slowly flow south all the way into the big lake, Lake Okeechobee, and continue on into the Florida Everglades. And so what happened with all this diking and draining, it's taking that natural flow away. It's get the water off the land in times of flood, create these big dikes and canals that would send the water out to tidewater or to the Atlantic in the east and to the Gulf of Mexico in the west. And so take, for example, coming south of Orlando in the Kissimmee chain of lakes on into what was a meandering stream called the Kissimmee River, where it slowly wandered southward through the oxbows with all the marsh grasses, cleansing the water as it went south, and then entered into that big lake called Okeechobee, which did not have defined boundaries, but instead marshy grasses all around the lake. And as the water, by gravity, continued to flow south into a natural extension of the marshy grasses into the miles and miles and miles of river grass that Marjorie Stoneman Douglas had declared so beautifully as the river of grass, the Florida Everglades. So Lake Okeechobee had a way of taking care of its water and keeping it clean. And instead, after losing 3,000 people in that hurricane, the idea was control the water, dike and drain it, dike the lake and drain it to the east and to the west, eventually into the St. Lucie River to go to the Atlantic and into the Caloosahatchee to go to the Gulf of Mexico. And meandering streams like the Kissimmee River were suddenly diked and dug into a straight ditch. Catastrophic for the sensitive estuaries that were cleansing the water as it moved south. Catastrophic for estuaries where so many of the critters were nursery grounds for those critters, many fish species. And lo and behold, across the entire southern peninsula of Florida, a dike was built called Tamiami Trail, a paved road from Miami over to the west coast, just south of Fort Myers and Naples. And that, in effect, became a dike across the southern peninsula of Florida that did not allow the water to flow further south into what ultimately, as a result of President Harry Truman signing it into law became the Everglades National Park. And the Everglades National Park was then consequently starved of fresh water. The consequences of all those actions over almost a century are painfully visible in years like this one because of the pollution of that water instead of the grasses cleansing it. Toxic blue-green algae chokes the rivers and spreads all the way out to the Atlantic Ocean, to the east, to the Gulf of Mexico, to the west. And people have seen in this past year the dramatic images of dead fish covering the water's surface, covering the beach on the west coast, and lo and behold, ultimately, that phenomenon of red tide being supercharged with green algae ultimately went around the peninsula of Florida and came up the east coast, and we saw the dead fish on the beaches of the Atlantic coast as well. Well, we need to return the water to as much as normal, the flow that Mother Nature intended. And that is what the restoration of the Everglades is all about. And that's how that started 18 years ago this month with a comprehensive plan to turn around that flood control, that diking and draining of all the southern half of the peninsula of Florida that has now caused much not intended effects. You think about it. When the ecosystem is healthy, the Everglades are healthy. When the ecosystem is sick, all the rest of that beautiful ecosystem is going to be sickly as well. And what we've seen with the little bit of cleaning up that we've done, the Everglades are amazingly resilient. The environment and the Everglades are the heart and soul of Florida. These precious natural resources deserve our protection and stewardship because now they provide drinking water for millions and millions of people in South Florida that have moved there, and for a major agricultural industry. And the Everglades also perform storm protection. And that's why the ongoing Everglades restoration effort is so important. We need to ensure that the glades are there to provide a buffer the next time that a hurricane rolls through. We understand there is a link between warming ocean temperatures and hurricane intensity. And if the climate trends continue, and I'll reference back to my speech on climate change and global warming and the rising of the seas, a speech that I gave last week. As that climate trend continues, if we don't reverse it, then it's all the more important to fortify Mother Nature's best defenses. Not only are beaches and the preservation of them one of those defenses, but so is the Florida Everglades. Beaches, wetlands, coral reefs, mangroves, all protect us against storm damage. We saw that during Hurricane Sandy and Hurricane Matthew in Florida, Sandy being in the Northeast. And we're learning that that proved true again during Hurricane Irma. And that's why it's so critical that we preserve natural infrastructure and conserve undeveloped lands. As that famous Floridian, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, said, there are no other Everglades in the world. The miracle of light pours over the green and brown expanse of sawgrass and of water, shining and slow-moving below. The grass and the water, that is the meaning and central fact of the Everglades. It is a river of grass. That was Marjorie Stoneman Douglas' quote. Well, since I've been privileged to be a member of the Senate, the federal government on that Everglades restoration plan has spent almost $5 billion on Everglades restoration. And we've got some great things to show for it, but we got a long way to go. Wading birds is an example. They're returning to the Kissimmee River floodplain. Water is finally flowing under that dike that was built in the 1920s, Tamiami Trail. Now there is a breach of a mile-long bridge, and there is another 2.5-mile bridge that is under construction to allow that water to flow south into the Everglades National Park. We're seeing the return of native wildlife in areas where projects are even still underway. And that Central Everglades Restoration Project that I referenced, that was passed in the water bill 18 years ago, it was originally envisioned as a 30-year plan because we knew we couldn't reverse all of the drainage and the engineering overnight. Out of 30 years, we're into the 18th year, 12 more to go. And it's a long-term effort, and it requires two things: diligent oversight over the ongoing work and an unwavering dedication to achieving Florida's goal of a restored Everglades. This senator, whose family came to Florida in 1829, I, a fifth-generation Floridian, understand that this is an important project to protect our beautiful natural treasures. But what happens if we don't? We've all seen the environmental and economic wreckage, for example, of an oil spill. We've seen NASA images from space of mangroves flattened after a hurricane. And as the hurricanes get stronger, more ferocious, more intense, that will be a result, as well as the wiping out of beaches. And all too often in recent years, this senator has seen the devastating impact of the toxic algae blooms on communities all over the peninsula of Florida and even into North Florida. When you take a body of water, and if you go and throw a fertilizer, sack of fertilizer in it, the combination of heat and the nutrients are going to grow algae in most any lake, but especially in the warm clime of Florida. As a result, by that same example, if you take our fresh water in Florida and you allow pollution to go into that because the pollution is not properly regulated, it puts the nutrients into the fresh water that will grow the algae. The algae will suck the oxygen from the water, and that becomes a dead river or a dead lake. And all those extra nutrients, then when they hit the salt water on the Atlantic coast or the Gulf of Mexico, they supercharge other phenomenon that lives in salt water, such as the red tide. We've seen that devastating impact. There was a Floridian that we recently lost, Nat Reed. He was particularly attuned to the needs of Florida's environment. We're going to honor his legacy in a memorial service this coming weekend. And we are because Nat Reed was one of the great defenders of Florida's natural bounty and especially the Everglades. He served in the 70s, both Presidents Nixon and Ford. He returned to Florida and he worked under 7 different governors in many different environmental capacities, including as chairman of the Commission on Florida's Environmental Future. And that commission, back there in the 80s, was instrumental in the land acquisition projects that we now know as Everglades restoration. For Nat Reed and his children and his grandchildren, for all of the current and the future generations of Floridians, let's honor the legacy of Nat Reed and let's stay the course over this next 12 years of this Central Everglades restoration project. Let's complete it and let's restore America's Everglades. Mr. President, I yield the floor.